He swore the baby wasn't his. Until 3 years later, he saw a little girl with his exact eyes in her arms, and everything unraveled. Michael Harding had always lived by one rule: control everything, feel nothing. As the CEO of one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the United States, he didn't believe in distractions, vulnerability, or anything that couldn't be measured, scaled, or predicted. He had built his empire brick by brutal brick, rising from a middle-class background to billionaire status before he was 40. His hair was the color of sun-bleached wheat, his eyes a cold analytical blue, and his presence in any room was enough to silence conversations. People respected him. People feared him. No one got too close. Except for Sarah. Sarah Martin was the only person who had ever slipped through the cracks in Michael's walls. They had met 5 years earlier at a conference in San Diego. She wasn't part of his world. She wasn't a CEO or a strategist or a tech investor. She worked in sustainability of all things, and had come to speak about eco-conscious supply chains. What started as a one-time conversation over coffee turned into a quiet kind of relationship, one with no contracts, no press, no declarations. Just two people meeting in the quiet margins of their lives. Sarah had long, dark brown hair, thoughtful brown eyes, and the kind of grounded calm that made Michael's storming mind slow down, just a little. She never asked for more than he gave, but she saw him, really saw him, and for a while, that terrified and thrilled him all at once. But when Sarah told him she was pregnant, everything shifted. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening in New York. They were sitting in his penthouse apartment, the city spread out like circuitry below them, the air full of the low hum of jazz. She held a cup of tea in both hands, her fingers visibly shaking, and then she said it. Gently, almost apologetically. "I'm pregnant, Michael." He didn't say anything for a full 30 seconds. Then he stood up, walked to the window, and stared out into the darkness. "You're sure?" he asked flatly. "Yes." Another long silence. Then, coldly, "And you think it's mine?" That question was like a blade across the room. Sarah set down her tea, her expression still calm, but her eyes now glassy with disbelief. "Think? Michael, we've been together for nearly a year, you know I wouldn't lie to you." But he didn't respond with comfort or apology. He was already calculating risk, exposure, complication. He saw headlines, lawsuits, leverage lost. He felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Panic. His voice sharpened. "I can't have this in my life right now. You know what's at stake." Sarah stared at him as though she didn't recognize the man standing in front of her. "What's at stake? Michael, this isn't a corporate deal. This is a child, our child." He turned back toward her, his jaw tight, his eyes cold. "You're asking me to believe that. But if you've been seeing someone else..." "I haven't," she snapped, finally rising to her feet. "I came to you because I thought you'd want to be part of this. I didn't come for your money, or your protection. I came because I believed there was something real between us." Michael didn't answer. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. And Sarah, heart pounding in her chest, understood that nothing she said would matter. He had already chosen to retreat, to reject, to protect himself, rather than trust her. He didn't cry when she left. She packed her things that night, refusing the car he offered to send, and took a cab back to her small apartment on the other side of the city. The next morning, she quit her job, closed her lease, and moved to upstate New York with her daughter from a previous marriage, 7-year-old Emily. She left behind the city, the corporate chaos, and the man she had once let into her life. Michael never reached out. Not when the due date came and went. Not when the baby Sophie was born with blonde hair and piercing blue eyes that mirrored his exactly. Not when Sarah sent him a brief message with a photo, just once, a quiet olive branch, which he ignored. For Michael, denial was easier than doubt. He buried himself in work, surrounded himself with strategic partners, and told himself that if it really was his child, she would come back again and prove it. She didn't. She disappeared entirely. And for the next 3 years, he lived his life as if nothing had ever happened. As if Sarah had been a passing distraction. As if Sophie didn't exist. But all the denial in the world couldn't prepare him for what was coming. Sarah Martin didn't break down the night she left Michael's apartment, though her body wanted to. Instead, she held herself together with the kind of quiet determination that only comes from deep disappointment. She focused on packing her belongings and keeping Emily calm, repeating soft reassurances that things would be okay, even though she didn't quite believe them herself. When the cab pulled away from the glittering skyline of Manhattan and carried them north into the colder, quieter stretch of New York State, Sarah stared out the window, holding her hand over her belly, and silently promised the child inside her that she would be loved, even if not by both parents. They settled in a modest rental house in a small town that had fewer lights and less noise. It wasn't glamorous, but it was safe. Sarah found a part-time job in a local herbal shop and worked late into the night researching how to create natural skincare products from home. Her pregnancy progressed quickly, and with each passing week she grew more confident, not in the future, that still terrified her, but in her ability to protect her children. Emily, though quiet at first, adapted quickly. She didn't ask about Michael, only noticed that her mother seemed tired more often and sometimes cried in the shower. When Sophie was born on a gray April morning, the room fell into stunned silence. The nurse, who had never seen Sarah's partner, looked down at the baby and then up at Sarah with surprise. The child was almost ethereal, fluffy blonde hair, bright sky-blue eyes, and skin so fair it glowed under the hospital lights. Sarah, exhausted and overwhelmed, stared at her daughter for a long time before reaching for her. Holding Sophie for the first time, she felt the weight of grief and gratitude at once. Grief for the father who would never know this moment, gratitude for the miracle in her arms. Raising Sophie was not easy. Sarah had no family close by and very few friends. Most days were spent balancing clients, inventory, nursing, and trying to give Emily the attention she deserved. But slowly, life found a rhythm. The business took root, first through local fairs and then online orders. Word of mouth spread. Her products, handcrafted, beautifully packaged and made with care, started gaining recognition beyond their small town. By the time Sophie was 2, Sarah had opened her own storefront. It wasn't big, but it was hers. Sophie grew into a curious, radiant little girl. She had an unusual gentleness for her age, but also flashes of defiance, especially when she felt something was unfair. People often commented on how much she looked like her father, always assuming Sarah's late husband had been blonde. Sarah never corrected them. Instead, she learned to smile politely and redirect the conversation, but every time someone said, "She looks just like her daddy," a silent ache pressed behind her ribs. Emily, on the other hand, had a quiet strength beyond her years. She loved Sophie deeply, and often took on the role of protector without being asked. She had seen her mother cry in the early days, and had made an unspoken vow to be her support. Though still young, Emily was deeply perceptive. She knew enough to understand that her sister had a different father, and that the father had chosen not to be around. She didn't forgive him for it, even if she didn't say so out loud. Despite everything, there was joy in their home. The three of them would dance barefoot in the living room, cook messy breakfasts on Sundays, and build blanket forts during thunderstorms. Sarah read stories to them every night, even when she was exhausted. She kept her business afloat while never letting either of her daughters feel second to her work. There was no bitterness in her parenting, only fierce love and a quiet resolve. Still, some nights, when the house was dark and both girls were asleep, Sarah would sit by the window with a cup of tea and allow herself to remember. She'd remember the way Michael's voice would soften just slightly when he was tired, or the way he used to rest his hand on the small of her back, without thinking. She remembered how, in brief, rare moments, she thought he might really be hers, and then she'd remember his face the night she told him she was pregnant. The sudden shift from man to machine. And the chill that had stayed with her since. She didn't regret walking away, she regretted believing he might choose differently. But time had passed. Her daughters were happy, the shop was growing, and she had learned that survival wasn't just about endurance. It was about creating a life where joy could still grow in the cracks left by disappointment. She didn't know that Michael had returned to New York. She didn't know he was now expanding his business into the northern markets. She didn't know that fate, after 3 years of silence, had begun to move its pieces again. But Sophie would change everything. And this time, Sarah wouldn't be the one knocking on anyone's door. The morning started like any other. Michael Harding stepped out of his black town car, crisp suit immaculate, silver watch glinting against the sleeve of his tailored jacket. The air was brisk and fresh, and the small town he had arrived in was quieter than he was used to. His executive assistant trailed behind him, reading off details about the new acquisition, the final piece of a regional expansion that would allow Harding Biotech to reach deeper into suburban healthcare markets. For Michael, this was just another city on a map, another opportunity to grow, to dominate. He had no emotional attachment to geography. Cities were chessboards, people were either useful or forgettable. The meeting with the regional clinics board was scheduled in a renovated building, across from a line of local shops. While his team set up inside, Michael stepped out to take a brief call. He disliked sitting idle, even for 10 minutes. As he moved toward the sidewalk, his eyes drifted lazily across the street. He was about to turn back when something, or rather someone, caught his attention. As woman was stepping out of a boutique flower shop, a little girl in her arms. They weren't facing him at first, but even from the distance, something about them tugged at his attention. The woman's long brown hair was loosely tied back. She wore a simple coat, and her posture had the effortless grace of someone unself-conscious. The little girl had her arms wrapped tightly around the woman's neck, chattering about something, pointing toward a balloon in a nearby window. Michael squinted slightly, curiosity stirring. Then the woman turned. The world didn't just slow, it stopped. Sarah? There was no mistaking her, though her hair was a bit longer and there was something different about her. Something more grounded, more assured. It was Sarah. She hadn't seen him yet, too busy adjusting the child on her hip. But Michael couldn't move. He stared, frozen on the sidewalk, as if the wind had been knocked from his chest. And the little girl. Blonde hair, wild and soft like down. Eyes bright blue. Unmistakably blue. His blue. She looked no more than 3, maybe a little older. Her features were delicate, innocent. But as Michael's mind raced, he saw it all. The shape of her chin, the slight tilt of her nose, even the way she pointed. Decisive, like she knew what she wanted. Every detail hit him like a brick. She looked exactly like him. Not just similar. Not maybe. Not could be. She was him. Sarah finally looked up as they crossed the street, her smile fading the instant her eyes met his. For a moment, time stood still between them. Her steps faltered only slightly, and in that pause a dozen emotions crossed her face. Shock, anger, hesitation, maybe even fear, but no surprise. It was as if she'd always known this moment might come. Michael, for once, didn't know what to do. He wasn't prepared for this. He had imagined from time to time what it might feel like if Sarah ever returned, if she ever tried to re-enter his life, with a child in tow. But in those versions, he held the power. He made the rules. This was different. He hadn't found her because he sought her out. He had simply stumbled upon a truth that refused to stay buried. Sarah didn't stop. She adjusted her grip on the child and walked past him with steady, purposeful steps. She didn't say a word. The girl glanced over Sarah's shoulder as they passed, her eyes meeting his for the briefest second before she tucked her face against her mother's shoulder. Michael's feet remained planted, his breath uneven. It felt like the edges of his carefully composed world were starting to fray. He didn't return to the meeting right away. When his assistant found him still standing on the corner minutes later, she asked if everything was all right. He nodded stiffly, dismissing her concern. But inside, a storm had begun to rise. Slow, quiet, but undeniable. Later that night, alone in his hotel suite, he sat in front of the large windows overlooking the town. He hadn't turned on the lights. The shadows of passing cars flickered across the ceiling. In his hand was a glass of scotch, untouched. His mind ran in circles. He remembered the last conversation with Sarah, the one that ended with silence, with distance, with her walking away. He remembered dismissing her claim, brushing it off as manipulation, as emotion clouding reason. He had believed he was protecting himself, his reputation, his empire. But now, faced with the living proof of his denial, he felt like a coward. For the first time in years, shame burned through him. And still, he didn't know what to do. He didn't even know if she would speak to him. But one thing was certain. That little girl, his daughter, existed. She breathed, she laughed. She pointed and clung to her mother and blinked up at him with his eyes. And Michael Harding, a man who had once refused to believe he could be anyone's father, realized with a slow, aching clarity that he had already missed the first 3 years of her life. He didn't know her name. And it was killing him. Michael didn't sleep that night. He paced the length of the hotel suite like a man possessed, 1,000 thoughts colliding in his head without any exit. Logic, his lifelong ally, had abandoned him. All the strategies, models, and structures he relied on to make decisions in business were useless now. There was no spreadsheet that could calculate how to face a woman you'd abandoned and the child you'd denied. At some point near dawn he made a decision. Not a plan, not a strategy, but something deeper, something human. He needed to speak to Sarah, not through lawyers, not through intermediaries. He needed to look her in the eye. By late morning he had tracked down the flower shop she had exited the day before. It wasn't hard. The town was small and his name still carried enough weight for people to answer questions when asked, but when he arrived he hesitated outside the glass door. Through the window he saw her arranging small bouquets, her hair pulled back into a low ponytail. Her movements calm, deliberate, almost meditative. She didn't look up when the doorbell chimed as he stepped inside. The shop smelled like lavender and mint. It was cozy, lined with small shelves of handmade soaps, candles, and neatly labeled jars of dried herbs. It felt nothing like the corporate world he came from. It felt real. When she finally looked up and saw him, her entire body tensed, though she didn't speak. She simply set down the scissors in her hand and folded her arms across her chest. "I didn't come to cause a scene," Michael said quietly. "Then you probably shouldn't be here," Sarah replied, her voice steady but brittle. He swallowed hard. "I saw you yesterday." "I saw her?" Sarah nodded once, unsurprised. "I figured you would." He took a tentative step closer, but respected the invisible boundary between them. "She looks exactly like me." "She does," Sarah said, her tone clipped. "And that's been my daily reality for the past 3 years." Michael exhaled, frustrated with himself. "I didn't know what to do back then. I panicked." "You didn't panic, Michael. You chose. You made a decision and stuck to it. That's what you do. You calculate. You cut what doesn't fit." Her words hit like blunt force. He had always appreciated Sarah's honesty, but now, it burned. "I was wrong," he said simply. "That's the understatement of the century," she said, turning her back to him and beginning to gather flowers again. "You didn't just walk away from me. You walked away from her. You didn't even want to know. You don't get to fix that with an apology." Michael stood in silence, watching her hands move, quick and precise, tying ribbons with the kind of grace that only comes from routine repetition. He realized this was the part of her life he had never been allowed to see. The strength she carried alone. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said after a long pause, "but I need to be honest with you. When I saw her, something in me, everything in me, shifted. I didn't just see a child, I saw a part of myself I never knew existed." Sarah turned back to face him, a tired anger still lingering in her expression. "And what exactly do you want now, Michael? To swoop in and be a father? Take her to brunch on Sundays and feel good about yourself again? This isn't a redemption arc for you." "No," he said, shaking his head. "I don't want to feel good. I want to feel responsible. I want to earn whatever I still can. I want to know her name." Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes softened, just a fraction. She could see that he wasn't putting on a performance. There was no charm, no polished mask. He looked exhausted. And he looked like he meant it. "Sophie," she said at last. "Her name is Sophie." He closed his eyes briefly, letting the word settle into his chest like a prayer. "That's beautiful." "She's beautiful," Sarah said, her voice breaking for the first time. And smart. And stubborn. She sings when she's tired, and she loves blueberries more than anything else. She thinks your face is on money. I told her it's not, but she insists. Michael let out a quiet laugh, not because it was funny, but because he didn't know how else to hold the emotions threatening to overflow. Can I see her? He asked gently. Not now, not today, just sometime. Sarah looked torn. She wrapped her arms around herself like she needed protection from the question. I don't know. I'm not going to pretend this didn't damage us. I've raised her alone. Emily has raised her. You're a stranger, Michael. And strangers don't just visit their children like it's a business pitch. I know, he said. But I want to become something more than that. And I'm willing to take the time. However long it takes. Sarah didn't answer. The bell above the door rang again, and a customer entered. She stepped away to help them, her posture turning professional and polite. Michael understood. The conversation was over. For now. He left the shop quietly, the scent of mint and lavender clinging to his coat, the sound of Sophie's name still echoing in his ears. He didn't know what came next. But for the first time in years, he wasn't walking away. Michael returned to the city with a restlessness he couldn't shake. The meetings he once dominated now felt hollow, like echo chambers full of scripted nods and mechanical decisions. His board members noticed the change in him, though no one dared mention it directly. He spoke less, listened more, and sometimes drifted off in meetings with his eyes fixed on something far beyond the glass walls of the corporate tower. His world, once carved with precision and devoid of emotion, had cracked open, and something entirely new was seeping through. Back in his penthouse, the silence became unbearable. The minimalism he once took pride in, sleek furniture, cold lighting, spotless surfaces, suddenly felt sterile, like a showroom without a soul. He found himself pulling out old files and photos he hadn't looked at in years. Somewhere at the bottom of a drawer, he found the single ultrasound image Sarah had once emailed him. He had never opened it. It was still sealed, unread, untouched. With trembling fingers he peeled it open. The image was grainy, dated, and small, but it felt monumental now. A heartbeat captured in grayscale, dismissed by a man too proud and afraid to see what was in front of him. He sat on the floor of his office with the photo in his lap for what felt like hours. The next morning he took action, but not in the way he used to. There was no announcement, no press release, no flashy demonstration of power. He simply called his assistant and cleared his calendar. He told the board he would be working remotely for an extended period, citing personal matters with a finality that left no room for debate. Then he drove back to that small town and checked into a modest inn near the center of town. The kind with mismatched bedspreads and creaky floors. It wasn't comfort he was after, it was presence. He didn't try to see Sarah immediately. He didn't want to force anything. Instead, he walked the streets, learned the rhythm of the town, and visited the shops without hiding his face. People whispered, of course. His name still carried weight, but no one approached him directly. He visited the local bookstore and bought a stack of children's books, carefully choosing titles he thought a curious 3-year-old might enjoy. He had no idea if Sophie liked to read, but he wanted to be prepared if the opportunity ever came. Days passed, and Sarah remained silent. He didn't blame her. He had burned every bridge between them. But then one afternoon, as he walked past her flower shop, the door opened, and Emily stepped out. She was older now, sharper in the eyes than he remembered from years ago, with the same chestnut hair as her mother, and a guarded expression that made it clear she had not forgotten anything. She looked at him without fear or politeness. Just a calm challenge in her gaze. "You're following us," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. "No," Michael replied softly. "I'm waiting." She considered that for a moment, then added, "Sophie likes mermaids, and honey on toast, just so you know." He almost smiled. "Thank you." Emily didn't smile back. "If you hurt them again, I'll make sure you regret it." And with that she turned and walked down the street like a soldier on patrol. Michael didn't stop watching until she disappeared around the corner. that evening he received a message from Sarah. Short, direct, and without emotion. "Come by tomorrow at 4. She'll be home." The next day, he stood on the porch of Sarah's home, heart pounding harder than it had in any boardroom or investor pitch. When the door opened, it was Sophie who appeared, wearing a mismatched outfit covered in glitter stickers and holding a juice box in one hand. Her eyes widened when she saw him, and for a long moment, she simply stared. Then, to his shock, she grinned. "You're the guy from the flower shop," she said, pointing at him. "The one who looks like my mirror?" Michael knelt down, unable to stop the tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. "Yeah," he said. "I guess I do." Sarah stood quietly behind her, arms folded, expression unreadable. She didn't say anything, but she didn't close the door either. Michael spent the next hour sitting on the living room rug, listening to Sophie tell him about her toys, her favorite breakfast, and the story she made up about a unicorn who lived on the moon. She asked him silly questions, poked at his watch, and called him Mr. Fancy Shoes. Sarah watched from the kitchen, saying little, but her silence no longer felt hostile. It felt cautious. Protective. When Sophie ran off to show Emily her crayon drawing, Sarah finally walked over. Her voice was low, almost tired. "She doesn't know who you are, not really. Just that you're someone I used to know." Michael nodded. "I'd like to change that. Slowly. With your permission." Sarah hesitated, then said, "We'll see. For now she thinks you're just someone who listens to her. That's already more than most." That night as he left, Sophie waved from the window, pressing her tiny hand against the glass. He touched the other side, quietly stunned by the power of such a small gesture. For the first time in his life, Michael Harding understood what it meant to feel humbled. Not by failure, not by defeat, but by the chance to become something he had never dared to be, needed. Michael began visiting Sarah and the girls regularly after that first quiet hour on the living room rug. At first it was only once a week, always prearranged, always with clear boundaries. He would come in the late afternoons, often bringing books or puzzles for Sophie and small gifts for Emily. Not extravagant things but thoughtful gestures, like a notebook with pressed flowers, or a small pendant that resembled a moonstone. He made sure nothing he brought looked like a bribe. It wasn't about buying affection, it was about showing up, being consistent, and proving through action that he was staying. At first, Sophie treated him like a favorite guest, someone exciting, someone who paid attention and always had time for her rambling stories. She'd sit on his lap and explain the secret languages of her dolls, or pull him into elaborate games where she was a princess and he was the knight who wasn't very good at following instructions. Her trust came quickly, almost too quickly, and Michael found that both heartwarming and terrifying. He knew what it meant to fail in business. He'd survived lawsuits, betrayals, market crashes. But the idea of failing this small, trusting person left him breathless. Emily, on the other hand, remained guarded. She would sit in the room when he visited, but rarely speak to him directly. She watched. Always watched. Sometimes she'd interject, if she thought he was being too eager, or if Sophie asked something that Sarah hadn't planned on answering. One afternoon, when Sophie had asked why Michael didn't live with them, Emily cut in sharply with, "Because he left. That's why." Michael had opened his mouth to reply, but Sarah had raised her hand. "Not now," she said, not unkindly but firmly. The moment passed, but the weight of it remained in the air long after. Still, the rhythm of connection began to settle into place. Sarah never let her guard down completely, but her walls weren't made of steel anymore. They were made of caution, of learned strength, of a woman who had survived abandonment and refused to let anyone near her daughters unless they earned their place. And slowly, Michael was earning it. Not through apologies. He didn't try to repeat those anymore, but through quiet effort. Then, without warning, the fragile peace was disrupted. It started with a phone call. Sarah had just closed the shop for the day when her phone rang, and the number made her chest tighten. It was her ex-husband, Emily's biological father. They hadn't spoken in over 2 years. He had no custody, no interest, and had vanished the moment child support enforcement caught up with him. But now he was back, and suddenly, he wanted to talk. Sarah didn't trust the sudden change. She listened to his voice, smooth, charming, unnervingly pleasant, and her stomach turned. He asked about Emily, then asked if he could visit. When Sarah said she'd think about it, he responded with a veiled threat. "You wouldn't want the courts involved, would you? You're letting that Harding guy hang around your daughters like he's one of them. Pretty sure that's not legal." She hung up without replying, heart pounding. When she told Michael about the call later that week, he listened without interrupting. Then he stood up and walked to the window, jaw clenched. "He's using me as leverage," he said finally, "to stir doubt, to assert control." "Bill always did know where to strike," Sarah murmured, rubbing her temples. "He doesn't want Emily. He wants power, attention. And he sees me happy, stable. He hates that." Michael turned back to face her. "Let me help. Let me hire someone, a lawyer, a mediator, whatever you need." "I can't let you fix this for me," she said, "not out of pride, but out of principle. But, if he tries to take Emily, I won't be able to fight him alone," Michael said, and his voice was unlike she had ever heard it before. Calm but cold, laced with something dangerous and deeply protective. A week later the paperwork arrived. A formal custody challenge. Her ex was trying to petition for joint custody of Emily, alleging that Sarah's relationship with Michael created an unstable environment. The implication was subtle but clear. Sarah was exposing Emily to a man with no legal ties to her, and possibly manipulating both children. The idea enraged Michael more than he could express. He had never laid claim to Emily. He had never overstepped. But now, to be weaponized like this, used as a legal threat against the woman and children he was just beginning to know? It made his blood boil. Sarah tried to stay calm for Emily and Sophie, but the stress showed. Her posture stiffened, her laugh became less frequent. She no longer lingered in conversations. One night, after the girls had gone to bed, she broke down in the kitchen, while Michael stood silently, letting her cry without trying to stop it. When she finally looked up, red-eyed and exhausted, she whispered, "I'm so tired of being alone in every fight." "You're not alone anymore," Michael said, his voice barely audible. "Not in this." They hired a lawyer together. Michael funded everything, without condition. He stayed out of the legal strategy, but provided every document, every witness, every character statement needed. He even agreed, on Sarah's terms, to a DNA test to formally confirm that Sophie was his daughter, so no one could ever use the ambiguity against them again. The day Emily's testimony was requested, Sarah was sick with nerves. She tried to talk her daughter out of it, fearing it would scar her, but Emily insisted. In the courtroom, dressed in a simple navy dress and holding her head high, Emily stood before the judge and spoke clearly. "I want to stay with my mom. I want to live with my sister. And I want Mr. Harding to stay in our lives. Because he listens. He shows up. My real dad doesn't." There was silence, even the judge had to pause. That statement, those 3 sentences, broke the entire case. Her biological father lost all ground. The court ruled in Sarah's favor, without hesitation. When they returned home that evening, the girls ran ahead into the house, laughing and shrieking with joy. Sarah stood on the porch with Michael, the late afternoon light stretching long across the grass. She looked at him for a long time. "You didn't have to stay," she said. "I never should have left in the first place," he replied. And for the first time, Sarah didn't look away. In the weeks that followed the custody hearing, something in the atmosphere around Sarah's home began to shift. The tightness in her shoulders, the cautious way she used to glance at the front door as if expecting another knock from her past, slowly faded. There was no more legal paperwork sliding through the mail slot. No more veiled threats hidden behind falsely polite phone calls. For the first time in a very long time, her world felt safe. But it was more than just the end of a legal battle. It was the beginning of something she hadn't dared imagine: stability with Michael. Michael had not only helped her navigate the storm, but he had done it without ego. He never used his support as leverage. He never reminded her of what he'd done or what it had cost him. He was just there, quietly, firmly, always there. He drove Sophie to the library on Saturday mornings. He helped Emily build a birdhouse for a school project, even though neither of them could figure out which way the roof should face. He began joining them for dinner once or twice a week, and eventually, Sarah stopped feeling like she had to watch his every move. One evening in early spring, after the girls had gone to bed, Michael stayed behind to help Sarah clean up. They moved in sync now, passing dishes and wiping counters with a rhythm that didn't need instructions. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, it was familiar, like a shared language spoken without words. When the kitchen was done, they stepped outside onto the small porch. The air still crisp, but no longer sharp. The sky above was full of stars, and Sarah leaned on the wooden railing, looking up. "I used to come out here when things got hard," she said quietly. "Back when Sophie was a baby? I'd stand right here and just breathe. Try to believe that things wouldn't always be so heavy." Michael looked at her, studying the lines on her face that weren't there 3 years ago. "And now?" "Now," she said, glancing at him with a small, almost shy smile. "Sometimes I forget what the heaviness felt like." He stepped closer, not quite touching her, but close enough to feel the warmth of her shoulder near his. "I wish I'd been here for all of it. The hard parts. The little parts. That's what the stories are." "I don't," she said, surprising him. "If you had come back before you were ready, I think you would have just hurt us all over again. But now, you're different. You're slower, softer. You listen more." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "You changed me. They changed me." "You changed yourself," she said, more firmly. "We just gave you a reason." They stood like that for a long time, the porch quiet except for the distant chirp of frogs and the rustling of trees. At some point, without thinking, Sarah reached for his hand. He didn't speak or move. He just let their fingers intertwine naturally, as if they had always belonged that way. From that night on, things between them weren't spoken out loud. There was no grand conversation about what they were or what they were becoming, but the energy had changed. The way she looked at him shifted. The way he entered the house, no longer knocking, just coming in with groceries or a new book for Sophie, felt like a man who wasn't visiting anymore, but returning. There was no pressure for labels, no race to call it something, but the closeness deepened. The family rhythms expanded to include him, and not because he demanded it, but because the space had been made for him naturally. Then came Sophie's birthday. She was turning 4 and Sarah had planned a small backyard party with homemade decorations and a chocolate cake topped with blueberries. Michael offered to handle the invitations, and to Sarah's surprise, he followed through with care and precision. He called every parent himself, even arranged for a local puppet show Sophie had seen in town and loved. On the day of the party, the yard filled with balloons, laughter, and children chasing each other through the grass. Sophie wore a crown made of paper and glitter, and Emily ran the music playlist from a speaker she'd set up herself. At one point, Michael lifted Sophie into his arms so she could blow out her candles. She looked at him with those same unmistakable blue eyes and said, loudly and clearly, "You're my best present." The moment silenced the crowd. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she held the cake knife. Michael looked up, stunned, caught between pride and the sudden intensity of emotion that stole the air from his lungs. Then, with childlike certainty, Sophie wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered something only he could hear. He didn't share what she said. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the girls were asleep, Michael and Sarah sat on the porch again, wrapped in a shared blanket this time. Sarah rested her head on his shoulder, eyes closed. "She knows," he said quietly. "She's known for a while," Sarah replied. "She just waited for the right time." Michael stared out at the moonlit grass, feeling an overwhelming calm settle into his chest. "I think I did too." Neither of them said anything more. They didn't need to. In that silence, everything was understood. Summer arrived with quiet certainty. The once cool mornings had warmed, and the air was filled with the scent of cut grass, blooming gardens, and something else. Something softer, less tangible. Peace. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but a gradual unfolding, like petals slowly opening to the sun. Michael, Sarah, Emily, and Sophie had found a rhythm together, not forced or defined by rules, but built from daily trust. What had once been tentative visits turned into shared routines. Michael began spending most weekends at the house, and then some weekdays too. He still kept his business running, but he delegated more, traveled less, and built a life that wasn't about escaping into work, but staying present for what mattered. Sarah no longer flinched at surprise phone calls or unexpected knocks at the door. Emily no longer watched Michael with suspicion. In fact, she started making him coffee the way he liked it, black with a dash of cinnamon, and left books on the kitchen table she thought he'd enjoy. Sophie began introducing him to strangers not as "Mommy's friend," but simply as "my daddy." The first time she said it without being prompted, Michael had to step outside for air. He stood in the backyard staring at the sky, one hand on his chest, as if he were holding his heart together. They didn't plan a proposal. There wasn't a ring or a grand gesture or a viral video-worthy moment. One night in late July, after the girls were asleep and the crickets had begun their familiar hum outside the window, Michael sat with Sarah on the living room couch, her legs tucked beneath her, a book resting face down in her lap. They were talking about something small. Chores, grocery lists, Emily's next school project. When he simply said, "Do you think we could make this permanent?" She looked at him, blinking once, then again. "We already have," she said. "But if you're asking me what I think you're asking me, then yes." And that was it. No nerves, no drama, just a quiet understanding between two people who had already lived through the fire and come out on the other side. The wedding was small, held in the garden behind Sarah's house, the same garden where Sophie had learned to walk, where Michael had first read to her, where Emily had once watched him from behind a tree with narrowed, cautious eyes. Only close friends and a few neighbors were invited. There was no press, no photographers, no designer gowns or choreographed dances. Sarah wore a soft ivory dress that she'd chosen for its comfort, not its sparkle. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders, a flower tucked behind her ear. Michael wore a light gray suit, no tie, his hands shaking slightly when he buttoned the cuffs that morning. Emily stood beside Sarah, holding her bouquet steady and proud. Sophie ran ahead of the ceremony in bare feet, wearing a crown of daisies, giggling so loudly that even the officiant laughed. When it came time for vows, Michael didn't read from paper. He simply looked into Sarah's eyes and said, "I once thought love was weakness. Then I lost you. And now I know, love is the only strength that lasts." Sarah didn't cry until later, when Emily stepped forward and, without being asked, read a short letter she had written. In it, she wrote about what family meant, and how sometimes people leave, but the ones who come back and stay, really stay, are the ones who matter the most. There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. After the ceremony, they sat on picnic blankets under strings of warm lights, eating homemade food and drinking lemonade. There was music playing from a speaker in the window, and Sophie danced in circles until she collapsed in the grass, laughing and breathless. That night, when the house was quiet again and the guests had gone, Michael tucked Sophie into bed. She was too sleepy to speak, but she reached for his hand and didn't let go. In the next room, Emily had left a small note on his pillow. It read, "You didn't just marry her, you married us." Michael stood in the hallway for a long time, the note in his hand, the sound of two girls breathing softly behind their doors. Then he walked to the kitchen, where Sarah was washing the last of the dishes, still barefoot, her dress wrinkled from dancing, her smile soft. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his forehead against her shoulder. "I didn't know life could feel like this." Sarah turned in his arms and looked up at him. "You just had to choose it." Outside, the stars hung bright in the sky, and in that small house filled with the echoes of old pain and new beginnings, a family exhaled, together, knowing that the hardest chapters were behind them, and the best ones were still being written.